Hi guys, I'm Philip J. Watt. This is the Redesigning Society series. Today we're going to look at communities and how we can redesign them to make them happier and healthier for individuals on a widespread scale. Today it is a pleasure and an honour to have our guest here today as we're going to be talking about a pretty serious topic that needs more attention in social and sort of political dialogue, and that is localisation versus globalisation. Our guest is Helena Norberg-Hodge. She's the founder and director of Local Futures and the International Society for Ecology and Culture. Local Futures' mission is to basically examine the root causes of the social and environmental crises that we face today, and let's face it, there's many that we really need to look at, and that's something that we'll unpack throughout this interview today. And Local Futures is also about promoting more sustainable and equitable patterns of living. And as we know, we're using up about 4 Earths in terms of resources at the moment, and we're at a sustainability rate of around 150%. So these are not just necessary, but they're inevitable. Otherwise, the impacts on humanity as a whole are going to be quite severe. She starred in a documentary called The Economics of Happiness. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it. It's a really good documentary, opened my eyes, opened my heart in many ways. She was also the producer and co-director of that documentary, and it also won quite a few awards as well, as I understand it. Part of what I love about you, Helena, is the very natural and your beautiful ability to speak softly and kind and compassionate about such severe negative issues. I mean, when I listen to you in these documentaries and on YouTube and whatnot, I'm like, now that's a palatable way to discuss this information. I get a little bit passionate about it. I can be very strong in my presentation, but you've just got this soft, kind way of delivering it and packaging it. So that's, I think, entirely important. All right, so we'll get into it. Sorry, I know that was a long-winded introduction, but let's start with the economics of happiness as well as Local Futures. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Okay, well, Local Futures, which is the organization I started and run, originated in this place called Ladakh, which is actually West Tibet. It's up high on the Tibetan Plateau. It's a big region, size of Austria, but with a very small population because it's an arid, the high altitude Tibetan Plateau is a desert, basically. This region of Tibet, the westernmost part of Tibet, was an independent kingdom, but had very close relationships with central Tibet, and the Dalai Lama is the spiritual head and was the spiritual head. But politically, it's belonged to India since the 1840s. And what happened is that when the Chinese went into central Tibet, the Indians sent up the army to protect this area, and no one was allowed to go there. And so the army sealed off all the borders. So this part of the world was basically sealed off until the mid-70s. And then the Indian government decided to throw it open. And I came out as one of the first Westerners. I was a linguist, and I worked on the language, and I learned to speak the language very quickly. So everything that I've been about since 1975, when I first encountered this Tibetan culture, has changed. I had a very broad cultural experience. I'm from Sweden, but I'm English and German, and I had lived in America, I had studied and worked in France. In fact, I was living in Paris when I went to Ladakh. So I had seen a lot of the world, also the so-called third world, but I had never ever encountered a people that had not been affected in any way by either colonialism or modern economic growth and development. And essentially, I encountered the happiest people I'd ever met, and people who were also very healthy. In fact, I was amazed. I simply didn't find any of the sort of poverty that we see throughout most of the third world. And then over the years, so I fell in love with this place. I ended up staying there at first to help to write a dictionary of the local language, which hadn't been written down before. And very quickly, as this area was opened up to the outside world, I became witness to essentially how the global economic system manages to destroy local economies. It took me a while to articulate it in exactly that way. At first I thought, well, it was the West that was coming and Westerners who were doing this. But I realized over the years that this was not actually about the West and Westerners per se. There was much more to do with what were originally Western banks and corporations, but that in many countries you will find businesses and banks based on this global model that are equally destructive. They're just simply too big and they operate as monopolies. And I ended up witnessing how, for instance, food from the other side of the Himalayas, having traveled for weeks, butter, for instance, would be driven up with huge amounts of diesel and delivered in the local economy at a price that was about half the price of local butter. And I ended up having witnessed that, studying this process in many other countries. So I saw that in Nairobi, Dutch butter cost half the price of Kenyan butter. I saw in Mongolia where they had 20 million milk-producing animals, and in Mongolia you could never run out of dairy products. I mean, that was the staple of their diet. And yet in Ulaanbaatar what you got was German butter. You couldn't even find Mongolian butter. In the UK, where I've lived for many years, butter from New Zealand was selling for a third of the price of butter from the farm down the road. So again, what I came to understand and study around the world was that this is not a question of rich countries versus poor countries. So as I say, it's not so much a question of Westerners and the West. It's a system that started in the West, and it's an economic system that has grown out of those structures where giant global businesses simply operate as monopolies and end up decimating local economies. They are also, by definition, using much more energy, much more packaging, and of course massively more transport than a multitude of smaller businesses. But it isn't only that. They are, by structure, they impose monocultural development. So they are responsible for pushing farmers to move away from providing a range of things for their local economy to just specializing on a few products and to grow bigger and bigger monocultures to provide for bigger and bigger middlemen to be transported longer and longer distances. So I would say that in a way, if I try to find the enemy in the world today, I would say that it's business that has become simply too big and global, and that in imposing monoculture, they're actually killing the planet and of course us, because monoculture is absolutely antithetical to life. And these monocultures are getting bigger and bigger, the distances are getting longer and longer. So we don't need to demonize the people. We don't need to say, oh, these are all bad people, because very often they're very blind. You know, they're often pushing the growth of their corporation because they tell themselves and they tell the world, we provide so many jobs, we're much more important than a small business. Yeah, one big giant multinational does provide more jobs than one small business. But guess what? Many small businesses can not only provide many, many more jobs, but actually much more satisfying jobs. And structurally, the gap between rich and poor cannot be as big. So we often get caught up in looking at old cultures and local small communities. We see there's a gap between rich and poor. We see there's corruption. And then we have a fear of local. And it's because we do not look clearly at the global, where the gap between rich and poor is so big that you don't even see the people who are actually exploiting you. So then you can sort of go along with the corporate propaganda that this is actually more equitable, it's more democratic, when it isn't. But there's another aspect to all of this which has made me a passionate proponent of strengthening local economies and local communities as a way of healing the planet, but very importantly, healing us personally as well. And this is something that I feel very few people in the Western world really understand. And it has to do with the psychological impact of this type of economic development. And so I witnessed firsthand how, along with these products coming in from the West, came imagery, came concepts, came a whole flood of ideas that basically made local people, particularly the young, feel that their culture was complete anachronism. It was old, primitive, backward, and the only way forward was to imitate what was marketed as a modern, sexy, and Western way of being. And what we really have to look at is how, in a whole series of ways, systemic ways, Western schooling, and that includes everything from kindergarten to university, Western science, Western modes of thinking, and Western media. Virtually every avenue of knowledge is being monoculturally occupied, essentially by corporations. So now people are beginning to write about this. A friend of mine here in Australia, Richard Hill, he's just written a book about the corruption in universities, because universities have become essentially giant businesses promoting monocultural commercial knowledge, and it's become extremely corrupt and extremely destructive. And so I saw how a key element in all of this is that this whole economic system is also one that dominates knowledge and that promotes a certain type of knowledge and a certain type of identity. And that identity is an urban consumer, ideally Western-looking individual. And these stereotypical images that then come with the media that reinforce what's being told in education, where, by the way, in the school books, they will literally talk about these primitive, ignorant people on the land and say, you know, they must be helped to move to the city as soon as possible. And the imagery is always one of perfection. And so the individual on the ground feels inferior. It took me quite a few years to actually analyze and to realize that the same thing was happening in my native country of Sweden, even though the ideal was very often, you know, blonde women with blue eyes, you know, nice and slim. I go back to Sweden and find that 6-year-old girls who were blonde, had blue eyes, were beautiful, were slim, were developing eating disorders already at the age of 6, saying, I want to be as thin as Barbie. And I saw this tremendous destruction that comes from this artificial, monocultural, stereotypical idea. So we are talking about a system that has had an effect on us for a very, very long time. And, you know, I don't know how long I should go on here, but I can say a lot more about the history of it, or should we come to that later? Should I?
Go for it.
Yeah. I mean, the history of it, as I see it, is that in many cultures, as far as we can tell from history, there were problems of elites exploiting poor people. And we had particularly examples of civilizations that would expand, and, you know, whether it was the Moguls and Genghis Khan or other invasions. And this is something that I think in the modern world we should agree is not a good thing to do. We should allow for much more peaceful, sustainable cultures that will have the right to develop according to their own values and principles. But what happened in Europe is that this particular civilization started becoming more and more powerful, and it became powerful through global trade. And the global trade included all kinds of manipulative efforts to pry open the East, in China, and often working with missionaries, so this sort of Christian Western commercial system started expanding across the world in a major way in the 1400s, but starting a little bit earlier. So we're talking about a very long history to this system. And what I think is important for us to realize is that even at the very center of it in the UK, the local people were also exploited. So people were pushed through the enclosures off the land and became cheap labor in the new factories. In the meanwhile, brutal force was used, genocide, extinction of indigenous people, and people either had to go and produce for Europe, whether it was tea or coffee or tin or whatever, or die basically. And but it's interesting to keep in mind that also white Westerners were also pushed off the land in a way that's very similar to what's happening in the third world today. And of course, Australia is a very good example of how these people, having been pushed off the land into this Dickensian London, where everything was filthy, polluted, crowded, all the social structures had broken down. Community structures where people managed the commons, managed their land, and managed to survive quite well. Maybe not perfectly, but a lot better than what happened in Dickensian London. And if someone stole a piece of old dried bread, they were thrown into boats and treated just like black slaves that were being shipped from somewhere or other and shipped off to Australia and treated like animals. And this is, I think, really important to understand the very brutal history of what is essentially an economic system that allows global banks and global traders to dominate society. Now, it's so easy when we talk about this, to imagine that therefore anyone who's trained into the leadership in those giant banks and corporations must be a psychopath or a sociopath. And my experience is that these people generally have been schooled today, shielded from the reality, the historical background I'm talking about, no one learns about, not in that way. And in fact, most of society goes along with the idea that large scale is efficient, that there are efficiencies of scale, that we need big business. So there's a way in which at the top, people are even further removed from the huge costs of this system. So I think really what we need so badly is what I call a big picture activism, where I think what you're doing is excellent. We need to get these perspectives out to build up a movement that is really holistic and that is very clear about the urgent need in a systemic and a strategic way to reverse this process whereby big banks and corporations get more and more power towards a system, in fact multiple systems, where a multitude of smaller farms, smaller businesses, essentially human scale, regional structures are able to dominate. So I'm happy that you're interviewing Jeff Lawton. I think permaculture is an absolutely central part of this shift, and it's very good to see how global it is. I do think that what we need is also beyond the actual growing and beyond urban agriculture, we need to be looking at, as you're saying, how to build a better society or how to build better societies. And that includes looking at banking, it includes examining knowledge systems, what type of schooling, what type of science makes sense. When we understand science as being an integrity and a desire to test your hypotheses, I'm all in favor of that. Wherever we can, let's test our hypotheses. However, We really have to understand today that because of this very sophisticated system that has become so big that we don't see it, we now have a type of science that is, I would estimate, at least 90% of what happens in the name of science is linked to narrow commercial interests, and usually to very large corporations. So whether it's in the pharmaceutical industry, whether it's in food and farming, whether it's now even in climate change solutions, we have to be really clear about the dominance of giant monopolies that cannot, they simply are not capable of responding to the life principle of diversity. They're not capable of delivering true democracy, true sustainability. Structurally, they are simply too big. You know, they're like elephants in a china shop. So, so we really need to see scale as a very important issue. I can say a lot more, but maybe you want to also have a word.
Oh, no, there's so many points I'd like to speak to on that. I'll probably forget some along the way, but
Yeah.
Anybody who has sort of even slightly awoken to this, I guess, corporate tyranny, or the empire, as you mentioned, that's been around for many, many, many generations, can see the influence it's had on media. It's really just mainstream media is corporate media, and it is a propaganda machine to fulfill a particular agenda and maintain the status quo. The same is politics. When we've got that sort of money that influence political campaigns, and then also the policies that are instituted from there, it's no wonder that we're struggling as a society. For those who actually want that change, who's open to that change, aware of the change that we require, the channels.
I think what's really important to realize about that is that even if in a country like America they've worked to have campaign finance reform and so on, but even if we do that, but still leave our doors open to corporate global media, in effect the media elects the politicians. So we really, this is why, you know, I talk about what I call localization. Now, by localization, what I'm talking about is not that everything has to happen, you know, on this tiny, tiny scale in the tiniest of villages. No, it's about a shift in direction. And the reason I use the word localization, even for large industry, is that I believe that we will only have democracy if business is subservient to society's rules. And if we don't insist that every business needs to simply belong to a place, if Mitsubishi wants to go off and be Brazilian, or, you know, if Volvo wants to go off and be German, okay, but they're going to have to then register in Germany. They have to adhere to the rules of Germany. And the reason why this is sort of the only way forward is because the other choice, which unfortunately a lot of people believe, particularly, you know, a lot of people on the left believe that, first of all, that it's impossible to insist that business needs to belong to a place. They also seem to believe that these giant multinationals have also had so much positive influence that we need to maintain it. But I think the third most important reason is that they believe that what we need instead is global government, global governance, global rules. And my experience, having grown up in Sweden, but also lived in America and so on, and seeing many different cultures and countries, is that I have found that in the smaller countries, there has clearly been a higher level of democracy. There's been a higher level of involvement by citizens in the government process. So we need to break down into smaller units for democratic reasons. And imagine if we had a global government. Imagine where those taxes are going to go to, some centralized, remote. First of all, it would have to be completely monocultural. Let's just say goodbye to all the languages of the world. Let's say goodbye to an infinite diversity of plants and ways of doing things. Let's let's look already what's happened in the EU, where they would sit in Brussels and come up with rules about when the hay should be brought in from the hayfields. So you sit in a pinstripe suit in Brussels and determine the dates for gathering hay. When, you know, parts of Switzerland, it's not even yellow yet. In other parts, it's far too late. You know, so it's just madness. It's a hubris beyond belief to think that we can manage in a truly sustainable way from such distances and in such a monocultural way. So we really need to decentralize or localize, and it's so much easier to ask business to belong to a place and adhere to the rules of a place than it is to imagine that we're going to have some kind of global government or global rules that can work. Having said that, I think that we need, and I'm as part of a process of economic change, we very, very badly need to shift the global rules to suit nature rather than big business. So what we have now is the WTO, World Trade Organization, which is essentially about harmonizing, so-called harmonizing trade and business. Essentially, again, monoculture, and what it means is you drive down all the diversity of cultural and environmental protection so that business reigns supreme. And the new trade treaties, as you probably know, the TPP and the TTIP, which is between Europe and the US, these treaties have clauses, ISDS clauses, so-called investor-state dispute settlement clauses, that where governments are signing in black and white, yes, you can sue us if we do anything that inhibits your profit-making abilities. You corporations who now reign supreme as some kind of global world government.
Well, that's a precursor to a one world government, if I've ever seen one.
Yeah, and you know, we've already had this suing going on, already from NAFTA, you know, US companies suing Canada and so on. And now we already have a Swedish nuclear power company called Waterfall suing Germany for 3.7 billion euros because they decided after Fukushima to phase out nuclear. And France has been sued for increasing its minimum wage. Australia sued by Philip Morris for its cigarette packaging. So I do not believe that almost anyone, if they truly understood and recognized what this means, would be in accordance with it. I really believe the most important thing that we need to do is to get the word out, this bigger picture. Let's look at this big global economic system, understand that it's also a cultural system, it's a media system, it's an education system, and let's, without demonizing, without anger, let's really agree it's got to change, and it's got to change soon. So one of the first steps would be to get the word out so that people prevent these latest treaties from being ratified, because they are giving even more power to these giant multinationals. And we need to think of those multinationals almost like a blind money-making machine, because the way they operate is also linked to the deregulation of trade and finance. That's what's happened in the modern era, particularly since Bretton Woods, since after the Second World War, the World Bank, the IMF, and the GATT was set up. The GATT was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that was a process that most people didn't look at. They weren't aware that these trade treaties, which all sounded friendly enough, that countries wanted to trade with each other, we still see them as being treaties between countries, instead of understanding that the forces pushing them are the deregulated banks and corporations that are pushing governments towards one standardized system. Many people believe, both inside big business and outside, that the problem we have with friction and violence, with environmental problems, has to do with a lack of standardization. And this is because these people are not in tune with the realities of the ground, the soil, human psychology, life. They're out of touch with life. And I have to say, sadly, many people are very much in touch with life, on the land, farming, and very much in tune, with the bees and the worms and their ecosystem. They usually do not have an opportunity or time to look at this economic system and to recognize that that is behind the scenes what is driving farmers out of business, or so this analysis of putting things together, that's really what in my institute and my networks what we're about. And I think so we're realizing that these giant businesses already way back when with the East India Company and with the enclosures in Britain, it's this long history. But after the Second World War was this big step in the name of not having another depression, creating this standardization and pulling all economic activity in the world under one umbrella. Now what we need, I started saying before, is exactly the opposite. We need, instead of a WTO, we need a WEO, a World Environment Organization. So what we so badly need is for those people who are in touch with the land, who are in touch with human suffering, and who understand the importance of community. Community. For me, maybe it's the single word that more than anything symbolizes the direction we need to go in. And I'm talking about community being with other forms of life, with the plants and the animals, and a sense of communion, of connection to nature and to others. That is something that should be considered a birthright. It's something that should be considered essential for human and ecological well-being. We are interdependent. We are totally interwoven with the earth. I mean, we know it. Indigenous people have told us forever. And we know it in the modern world too. We talk about it. We talk about the interdependence. But we're not really looking at the contradiction between that realization and knowledge and this economic system. Those are some of the pieces that have to be put together. But so from the ground up, there is a movement which, I broadly label localization, where people in many different ways are reweaving the fabric of connection, consciously reconnecting to others and to nature. And they, very often it's not called localization, it's called permaculture. It may be called slow food, it may be called slow money, slow cities, sustainability, and all kinds of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, is really about localization, because it's about rebuilding face-to-face community to support a healing. And it's, for me, seeing how effective these projects are, or initiatives that rebuild community, even with the most hardened drug addicts or alcoholics or with eating disorders. The key element is the community, sharing with others, supporting each other. And there is something, it's in our DNA, I would say. This is how we evolved. We evolved in groups. We didn't evolve isolated, in a high-rise building sitting in front of a screen. We evolved in connection with others and with nature. So, even though we need business to be localized, we absolutely need international collaboration today, because we've created such an enmeshed, globalized system, which is having huge environmental effects. Something done on one side of the world, like DDT, affects the bird life on the other side of the world. Nuclear radiation, genetic engineering. So we have these incredibly powerful tools. Most of those, in fact, should be banned, as far as I'm concerned. But we can't undo things overnight and suddenly retreat into our little local economies. So we urgently need international collaboration. And we need to build up the will to have a WEO instead of a WTO. In other words, That's a World Environment Organization that recognizes that the economy is nature. There is nothing we use, nothing, that doesn't emanate from nature. Our computer screens, our telephones, everything. So keeping nature healthy and happy is the only way we're going to keep an economic system going, the only way we're going to survive. So we need to build up that awareness. Some movements are about nature's, the rights of nature. There are many movements that are about protecting nature and enshrining the rights of nature as preeminent. I personally think that if this movement is built up by really making it clear that the same current WTO system that is destroying nature is also threatening your job, is threatening your pension fund, is threatening the stability of your nation's state, which can't even afford to look after its people anymore. That WTO model, that global corporate multinational model, is simply not working for your economy, it's not working for your health, it's not working for democracy. So if we build up the movement in a big picture way, I think we could get a very powerful movement that will understand that we absolutely need to protect nature. And whether we do so because we have a deep spiritual love of nature and an understanding of its beauty, of its our love for nature, or whether we do it because we're worried about our jobs, we need to get together to shift away from the WTO to the WEO. WEO could be nation states agreeing, which again would only happen if grassroots movements articulate and spell out the agenda. We have to really understand that right now our governments are not representing us, they're representing the needs of big business. So we have to turn that around. We have to insist on having representatives that represent us and that represent nature. And then the structural organization, it would not be that complicated. It would really be about the WEO ensuring that whatever you do in Zambia or in Ladakh or in Sydney, Australia, that has an environmental impact on other nations or on other groups. And a negative impact can't be done. But within an umbrella of protection, there's infinite possibility for diversity. So there are many different models and many different ways of doing things. And the key is to understand the richness and the wealth that will come through a shifting away, not just from a top-down, exploitative, corrupt model, but a monoculture towards diversity. We have no idea of the potential for beauty, for a type of wealth, even material wealth, that would come from embracing, using, we haven't even begun to be able to count the diversity of plants and species that we still have, even though we know that many are going extinct. But the understanding what could happen in the modern world if we actually were allowed to develop the architecture that would be adapted, to different ecosystems, different climates. Instead of a cement box with no windows that has to have, huge amounts of energy to stay cool and hot, adapted architecture, etc., etc., and using modern techniques, using some elements of modern science, using renewable energy, using glass in windows. There is such a, for me, having just seen what we were able to do in Ladakh, where the temperature drops to -40 and so on, with just passive solar energy by simply importing some glass, to see how you can literally have, a modern, comfortable house, but with the most beautiful adobe brick or rammed earth walls, far, far better insulated against the cold than modern concrete and most modern materials, etc. Anyway, so there's there is a way forward that is so much richer than people realize, but it will require a systemic, fundamental shift, which will include education, the development of skills, very different forms of technology. So that's maybe I add one more thing, which is that for me it's so exciting to actually see that on the tiniest scale and with almost no help from above, zero money virtually, zero support from the media, zero support from mainstream science academia. Around the world, wherever I go, I see people doing amazing things. There are these inspiring, wonderful projects everywhere you go. And they're so much more inspiring when you realize how they've been sort of born out of people's intuitive, almost unconscious way of turning towards nature. We talk a lot about consciousness, but I would say that what's sort of driving things is almost more, like what I just said, is almost more an unconscious desire to reunite, to reconnect with our true home, with who we really are. And we are interdependent beings. We are also whole beings. So for us, the whole localization movement that is about this reconnection is also about reconnecting mind and heart. Mind, heart, and body, becoming more embodied. And everywhere I look, I see people recovering a different idea of spirituality, away from this thing up in the sky, pure and light, realizing that the earthworm and that our bodies and our sensuousness are just as spiritual as the pure crystal light, and the sort of some of the old Christian and the older forms of spirituality are actually a type of spiritual materialism that again is based on a fragmentation and not understanding the wholeness and the need to embrace the embodied path towards reconnection. And so, as I say, the reconnection is that connecting our minds with our hearts, with our bodies, recognizing, as now people, there's a lot of scientific evidence of the intelligence of every cell, the intelligence of our bodies, the fact that our bodies carry memories. To me, even that new research, involving post-traumatic stress and healing and so on, recognizing that the cells have memory, it's all part of that same systemic shift towards wholeness. The way that the dominant system that has been so linked to commercialization has ended up encouraging fragmentation is something I would also like to say something more about. Because again, in Ladakh, it was so clear. I mean, I was literally seeing this whole way of life coming in. And it was driven by economic needs, driven by giant corporations. But it took the form of a cultural change from every level, every aspect. So the knowledge that had been guiding their culture, which was Tibetan Buddhism, had at its very essence the reminder of the interdependence and the oneness of life. It had at its very essence the reminder and tools and technologies for stilling the mind, for actually maintaining joy and peace within ourselves, and as a way of maintaining joy and peace around us and with others. It wasn't a perfect paradise, but I have never, ever encountered people who were as happy as the Ladakhis. I have never myself felt so happy as many, many years of living in traditional Ladakh. But, the tragedy of this dominant system, training children away from that holistic, truly conscious way of being and thinking towards reductionist, narrow, fragmented knowledge, And the message also very clearly being, you people who are close to nature are backward and primitive. The way forward is away from nature. The imagery, the romanticization of the urban consumer culture is very much taking you away from nature. Now, there is also what makes it more complicated is that within the corporate world, they realize that worldwide there is this longing to reconnect with nature. So more and more things are marketed as though they are about the natural or nature. So it gets a bit tricky. But in the early days in Ladakh, it was so obvious, you know, you would literally have adverts that would say about food, 100% synthetic. And then you would have agricultural experts, you know, boasting about how the modern vegetables had 10 different chemicals on them. And this was a great source of pride because that was seen as the more modern and the more superior. And this is still going on, you know, throughout much of the so-called developing world.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that's just
yeah.
No, sorry. Look, it's amazing. It's amazing what you've been discussing there. It really can be captured in an ideological shift that we need to go back to. This stuff isn't new. You're talking about the interconnection and interdependence with each other, interdependence with Earth, the philosophical, I guess, connection to just reality itself is it can be so fundamental to how we organise our systems and create organisations such as the World Environment Organization that you're saying, that there needs to be a huge ideological shift to do that. And it is absolutely necessary. And it's very refreshing to hear you actually talk about that, because who's going to manage all these nuclear weapons and all the rest of the negative technological advancements, or the potential that these technological advancements could have on society? So, but at the moment we're following the paradigms of consumerism, materialism, and this is where I want to go back to before, because you mentioned the happiness factors of the Ladakh people, and that they had no poverty, they had no emotional poverty, mental poverty, poverty from the heart, as you're talking about, and also physiological or material poverty as well. And they've gone to, I guess, had a reflection of modern day society and thought, oh wow, there's all these things that we never thought about. They must be really modern and awesome, and it must be a better way of life. But all those models have done is brought us a lot of dysfunction and pain and suffering called first world problems. Have a look around. I mean, you were talking about before connecting the grassroots to to the rest of society and getting people to understand the systems that we work on and the negative impacts from those systems and the history for how those systems developed. And that's all really important, but a really good way to actually connect, really personally connect an audience with that information is for them to understand why they're suffering and with their sorts of suffering. So addiction, mental illness, addiction to drugs, so the pharmaceutical drugs, they're the worst, pretty much the worst drugs besides alcohol, and cigarettes. So then you've got, I guess, a lack of community integration and just general feeling of uneasiness, and then this investment, emotional investment in the celebrity world, where celebrities are reflecting back to us where they're depressed and they're not actually happy, and some are actually killing themselves. So that's a clear reflection that money and power and all these sort of ego-based and image-driven sort of desires of society aren't actually achieving or creating any happiness. Yeah. And so that's where I want to lead into the Ladakh people. You talked about their health and happiness, and if as a modern society, these consumerist, materialist frameworks that we operate under the guise of capitalism almost, and capitalism is great in and of itself, but the way that it's been manipulated and the free market, I guess, fabricated and made not free, all these things are an impure representation of how we could actually operate as our trade together. And what have they created? what they've created all this social.
Sorry, but do you hear that chainsaw, or does that not bother you? Do you hear
Uh,
that? Maybe I better close the doors. You
sure.
hear it?
I might continue where I was because I love the symbolism of that. The symbolism of the chainsaw. We had to stop because of the chainsaw. It's almost like a symbol of us cutting through the barriers of the mind, trying to get actually to the core of what's going on in reality. And what I was saying was how these systems have created so much suffering in the individual because of these individualistic and materialist and consumerist philosophies and paradigms that you operate under, that ask any average person, are they content? Do they have inner peace? Have they figured out a philosophy to connect them with nature, to connect them with the universe, to connect them with a sense of self-worth that isn't dependent on any other sort of way of operating, way of life? And they'll say, no, I'm sorry, I haven't. I'm too busy watching TV and I'm too busy mesmerized by the material items I should be buying.
Yeah.
So that's a really good way to connect people to these sorts of truths.
Yeah,
What is actually happiness? And this is where my question comes in. What is it? What are those key factors that actually make up a happy and healthy person, as you witnessed in the dark people?
Well, for sure, what I witnessed was that being surrounded by a significant number of people who nurture you as a child is very important. So people grew up more closely connected in an intergenerational web of grandparents, uncles, aunts, neighbors. And so for every child, there were about 10 live-in caretakers. So the mothers were then also more free, and there was no one getting stressed, even if the baby was ill, because there were so many different arms to carry it. That, I think, definitely was one of the keys. It's very interesting that they did not focus on the child. I see a lot of people in the modern world maybe feeling guilty. You know, I see all these parents bending over 3-year-olds, asking them, what do you want to do? Well, that didn't happen in traditional culture. It was very clear to the child that they were to emulate the older siblings and the elders. And it wasn't a question of the 3-year-old deciding what the whole family was going to do. That's just a sort of additional side thing where I also hope one of these days to do a book just on childcare, you know, based on 40 years of observing change in this culture, where I've also seen what this modern system brings. I think it could be helpful, I think, for people. But anyway, it's quite interesting. You know, you were saying, do we derive our happiness without needing anything from outside? And my sense is that the very best way to ensure that people are happy is for them to have that much love and care and security as small children. And if you've had that as a child, you already, almost by age 3 and 4, you're starting to help children younger than you, and you become a loving and caring person. Paradoxically, through that sense of connection, people are also so much more independent. They're also so much more relaxed in themselves and in who they are. So they don't have this feeling. Are you still there?
Yeah, I am. It's saying that your network bandwidth is low, but that happened before at a certain point, and then it popped back up. So I'm sort of mentally, telepathically telling it to figure itself out. And then we go. Perfect.
It didn't come up here. It
No.
came up last time.
What it does is it shrinks my screen and then it says NHS bandwidth low. So I'm trying to listen to you, but tell it to fix itself at the same time.
You were so still. You were so still. I thought you were frozen.
Yeah.
So you know, paradoxically, in having so many people connected to you and feeling a sense of belonging and that sense of interdependence, experiencing that as a young child, then gives you a security that makes you more of an individual. I find this just so fascinating, that these people were so much more able to be themselves and to be so in themselves contented, and this clear sort of inner peace, a relaxed sense of self-acceptance. And the self-acceptance was so deep that the self wasn't an issue. Now, I saw very clearly what happened with the new system coming in, where young people were made to feel that they were backward and ugly. And suddenly, by being made to feel inferior, you see people trying to puff themselves up and looking as though they're very self-important, but they're actually desperately trying to identify with and seem part of this very distant commercial system. And, you know, just like the girls in Sweden wanting to be like Barbie doll, Ladakis, none of us can actually live up to one-dimensional images of who we should be. And when we have a one-dimensional image of who we should be, it always appears more perfect than when your role models are real people. When your role models are real people, then you know nobody's perfect. This person may be a bit prettier, this one is a bit funnier, this one has more skills. Nobody's perfect. And I shape my sense of identity on realistic role models. That's one of the keys also to happiness. Another key was not being segregated into monoculture. So the monoculture is also at school. When you segregate children into a group, like in kindergarten, 1-year-olds, you've got 31-year-olds that cannot help each other. So you just get elbows and screaming and competition. When you have 7-year-olds segregated, they are mentally at the same level. They cannot have the sort of collaborative relationship that you have when you have different age groups interacting. There's a whole, I could write a whole book just about that, you know, the monoculture or the segregation into separate age groups, fundamentally creating insecurity, competition. It's like a knife cutting through the connected web of relationships that people have when they are more intergenerationally related. So that's another key element. Another key element was that everyone regularly got quite a lot of exercise. It's very clear, and you see in the modern schools, that you take these 5-year-olds, segregate them into monoculture, then you keep them sitting still all day. And it's like a recipe for unhappiness and violence, especially with the boys.
And when they move, give them drugs and label them as having ADHD.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it's just, you know, there's so many levels of disaster, because using our bodies and moving combined with contemplation and learning, you know, is obviously so much healthier. Another aspect which I found in, you know, have tried to learn from, is that in almost all traditional cultures, people sang and made music together, sang, danced, made music. And I have found that singing together, not to perform, but actually as part of a group or chanting together, is one of the most connecting and, in a way, spiritually rewarding things we can do. Now, this is something most people did in most cultures until this modern corporate consumer culture, which started presenting people with images of perfect singers, or on the radio the best, and then suddenly you don't feel good enough. So I would say that, you know, so this wholeness of life, you know, all contributes to a sense of happiness. And another aspect of this life was that in the smaller scale units, where when you make something and you see either how you can use it or others can use it, or you grow something and you're able to, you know, eat it yourself, or other people benefit from it, in those more connected economic systems, you also have a sense of meaning in terms of your productive work. And so this is another thing that changes in the modern system. Everything is mediated by giant institutions, governments or corporations. So we don't have the satisfaction of more meaningful work. And well, and then of course the community aspect in all of this was also that people felt they felt held in a sort of vessel of knowing that if they need help, they would get it, and the willingness to help others. So there was a sense of security, which is, again, in the Western world, when we learn about traditional culture, we're told just the opposite, that they were completely insecure, they might die in a flood, or, you know, child mortality. And so what I found is exactly the opposite, that people felt more secure. The part of all of this was also this constant reminder of interdependence. So the spiritual traditions that reinforce the way of life by reminding people that we are interdependent, whole creatures, even though it might appear that we are separate from one another. The truth, the underlying teachings of Buddhism is this interdependence. Very often Western scholars, and also as part of a whole system that undermines our respect for traditional cultures, the message is that these tribal people, they didn't individuate. They didn't know how to individuate the way we do. We are true individuals. What I always say about that is that there is not a child that is born from its mother's womb that ever thinks that it is one and the same as its mother. The separation is not something that has to be taught. It's not something that we need to boast about as progress. The separation is very clear, is very visible. It's the interdependence, it's the interconnectedness that needs wisdom teaching, that we need to be reminded of, because those bonds are much less clear than the separation is. And this is, of course, why every spiritual tradition virtually has been about reminding people of the oneness of life. And so that, in turn, you know, the sort of way of life that was based on deeper interdependence and connection with others, with nature, and the reminding of that through the spiritual traditions, I would say that's what contributed to people's happiness.
Well, that's actually something that contributed to mine too. You know, I found my sense of peace through philosophy, through engagement with the people around me, by giving myself, sharing myself, being a part of something greater than my own little ego that wants to achieve certain little wants and have a certain TV or a computer or whatnot. And it was such a lie, and I know firsthand how damaging it can be to one's health, not just emotionally and psychologically, but also behaviourally, philosophically, just in you know, your creativity suffers underneath those sorts of ways to operate. So it was definitely something that I felt firsthand. I wanted to mention too.
But can I also just add another thing about the happiness? Because another thing that I think for us that really, really can help is the deep connection to nature, you know, to being out in the wilderness. I was talking before about the community as being an absolutely central part of Alcoholics Anonymous and so on. But those projects that link a spiritual connectedness to nature and that take people out into the wilderness and to actually help them to quiet the mind and to just experience this sense of expanded self that comes from being in nature. In our culture, because of the very hyper-individualistic, separated, fragmented, competitive way, it's sometimes hard for us to interact with others in a way that can take us towards this spiritual, more enlightened way of being. So often going into nature can be the best thing for us. And what I discovered with these traditional people, and in Mongolia with the Maasai and many other traditional people I visited, is that they spend a good part of the day, usually, out in wild nature, often by themselves, you know, maybe with some animals. But interestingly enough, in terms of coming back to cook, to sleep, you know, it's the community fabric, and of course, you know, to care for young children and for the aged and so on. But this being out in wild nature is also another very, very important part of happiness. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's all right. Absolutely no problem. Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's something that I absolutely prioritise in when I got some spare time. I want to go back to something you were saying before about the community events where everybody would be a part of a collective and sing together and dance together. And that's a very tribal, primordial group activity that has been around through every generation, and it exists now. The problem is that the ideological pressures, such as ego-based, image-driven, competition, all these things when you go to parties in the modern world, it is this selfish, greedy, competitive environment where it's about trying to be better than another person. And if people start to realise nobody's better than anybody else, we're all fundamentally equal. We do have certain levels of development, like, you know, somebody might be more emotionally developed, or somebody might be more developed in their capacity to be compassionate, and another person might be more developed in their empathy. That doesn't make either one better than each other. They're just on their own path of learning and growth is a beautiful purpose that each person has an individual experience with, because we're all at a different stage on our paths, aren't we? You know?
I actually think that if we could realize that most of those people who you say are trying to show that they're better, in actual fact, what's going on is that they're trying to puff themselves up because they haven't felt loved and acknowledged enough. So it isn't actually, generally speaking, that people, you know, are really trying to show that they're better. They're just desperate for love and recognition. And so this, it fuels this vicious cycle of, you know, trying to show off and, oh, I'm so important, I'm better, you know, I'm best at this. But really what it is a cry for love.
Absolutely. It comes from a place, it comes from a place of insecurity and fear and trauma and all these things that they don't feel, they feel so isolated from everybody else. And,
I think that one of the things that's happened also is that with these media images, what people are told is that if you want the love and recognition that we all want, you've got to seem important, you've got to have this, and you've got to be better than the other. So this whole culture emphasizes that. And I think before we were talking about how unhappy people are, there's a very strange way in which many Westerners, suddenly if they think about other cultures or non-Western people, they suddenly follow the sort of corporate messages, oh, well, we're so well off and they're so poor. And they forget that actually in their own culture, the rates of depression, of alcohol addiction, of children wanting plastic surgery, all the indications are that the unhappiness is skyrocketing. But so this, I think, is paradoxically, you know, one of the most important things we need to do in the consciousness movement is to, yes, talk about how to develop the spiritual practices and so on, but also have the big picture to really explain to people that if you're feeling depressed, if you're having an eating disorder, if you have feeling frustrated with your work, don't just internalize it and blame yourself. Also, not blame, but understand the system so that you can take some of that self-hatred and some of that self-blame off your shoulders. So it's not a question of beginning to sort of hate them, you know, or, you know, and these thinking that these people up on the top.
In my view, any hate is just another self-abusive action.
Exactly. You know, anger, hatred, once we start really feeling how that eats away at us, again, we start realizing a really enlightened way to be. You know, it just does not do us any service. helps. You know, it really doesn't help. And of course it can be justified. Of course you can understand why somebody's angry. And so if you do get angry, don't be hard on yourself for that either. But try to remember that the sooner you can meditate or get out into nature and really do positive visualization or something, the better you will be.
Absolutely. You know,
I think the statistics about the depression, about the unhappiness, I would like us to see that spelled out. I'd like to see us spell that out much more. And especially, I wish people could see the international picture that I get to see, which is how in the dominant mainstream culture, you know, I mean, it's just horrific. The suicide among young people, suicide among farmers, the students in South Korea, I mean, the fear of failure in the workplace and at university, you know, nervous breakdown, suicide, it is just an epidemic. So we need to stop and ask why. And if we can link that to the destruction of the planet, to the destruction of jobs, to the destruction of democracy, that's where I think this big picture movement, this consciousness movement about the truth of interdependence, the truth of diversity, the truth of connection versus the sort of lies that we're being fed through a system that is actually about division, separation, competition, and be very clear about which system we're supporting, which movements we're supporting. And I see, you know, so you see this spread in the dominant culture that's incredibly depressing. And I see a lot of people getting depressed. But what absolutely keeps me going is this seeing people waking up and seeing all kinds of wonderful projects, seeing the essential goodness, the essential desire to be loved and to love. You know, that's what connection is about. You couldn't, of course, you couldn't give me a single baby in the world that will not respond positively to love. It's in our nature, of course, to want to be loved. And when we don't get that love, we can become angry and we can become violent. But so to see, you know, love as the way, and to see fear and competition as what we want to turn away from, linked to, I would say, an analysis of the economic system, that's where I think the consciousness movements are still lacking. I think that there's a lot of consciousness about sustainability, about ecology, about human consciousness, but there's not enough looking at that bigger picture of the economic system, and that piece needs to be brought in as part of the whole. So that's what we try to do in Local Futures. That's what the film, The Economics of Happiness, is about. So I very much hope that people will watch the film. There is definitely a waking up to the role of these trade treaties happening now. Mm-hmm. And it's so, for me, it is such an opportunity that these trade treaties are, you know, so blatantly anti-democratic, anti-environmental, anti-society, that people are waking up. Because what was happening in the last 30 years is that far too few people understood that this was the arena where big banks and big business were getting more and more power. So a lot of activists who were against multinational power and so on were not opposing trade treaties. So that, to me, is like this, it really is the main reason. These trade treaties are the main reason why corporations and banks have so much power. And we should, you know, I just want to mention that the banking power is the power for banks to create more and more money out of thin air, to use it as a speculative weapon against our democracies, against our health, against our, the literally quadrillions are being produced in this way as speculative derivatives and instruments.
Hedge funds and...
Yeah, and that drive these giant corporations. So we have to see that again as a system and not believe that it cannot be changed. It is there because we are ignorant of it. And, you know, every minute that we continue to think that we can't change it, is our contribution to that system. Whereas understanding that it's a socially made thing, and it's really only happened because we've been ignorant of it.
That's
We
right.
don't have economists. We don't need to rely on economists. There are so many websites. One of them is Positive Money. It's quite a good website to look at the whole money creation. Ellen Brown, who's promoting public banking. You know, this is really part of localization, is that the banks need to be democratically controlled. That's what public banking is about. And so that's part of the whole localization shift that we're recommending. Other movements that are very alert and growing and powerful are movements like Via Campesina, about 200 million farmers that have been trying to raise awareness about the trade treaties for now more than 30 years, and that are fighting for what they call food sovereignty. Of course, the movements also, of course, permaculture we mentioned before, which is worldwide, and also Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, and the Five-Star Movement in Italy. These are all people's movements that really give you some hope that people can have a say.
I guess there's
Many of those movements are not necessarily based in the ecological and spiritual, if you like, sort of, I would say, community ecology and the spiritual connectedness, the spirituality. A lot of those movements are not founded in that as the way we need to move. So therefore, they generally are not proponents of localization, but they're very exciting in terms of realizing that there's real people power in saying no to the dominant system. But I think we need a vision, not just of what we're against, but what we're for.
absolutely. And it's on an individual level. Doesn't matter where you live, what country you are, what your local area is. One of the most important things to do is unplug from the system to the best of your ability as well. Don't have have as little attachment as you can to it. So mainstream media, remove yourself. Go to the alternative media. There's plenty of beautiful, rich information there. Obviously, there's also propaganda and bias and whatnot as well, but you've got to sift through it. And just like the mainstream media has a lot of truth in it as well, it doesn't show the big picture of reality.
So I'd say that one of the most important movements worldwide is what we broadly call the local food movement. Now, it doesn't actually necessarily see itself as a local food movement because it consists of so many different things like permaculture, Via Campesina, slow food movement, and 1,000,001 initiatives. Particularly exciting is where consumers link up with farmers through community-supported agriculture, through setting up consumer-producer co-ops, through setting up new farmers markets. As we reconnect to build more localized food systems, we're beginning to create the real cradle for a healthy economy. It should be considered a human right worldwide to have access for basic foods, to have access to a diverse, healthy range of food from not too far away. It's all relative, and we just need to start shortening the distances. But I can also tell you that having helped to start a lot of local food initiatives and seeing them all around the world, that it is such a win-win strategy because so often it's about rebuilding the community fabric between people, about reconnecting to the living world, and often in a very creative and inspiring way. You know, when children learn to grow something from seed, it's like it's becoming part of the cycles of life in a way that is so inspiring and so healing. So I see these social, ecological, spiritual, and economic benefits from the local food movement. So I would put that right at the top of all of the movements that we should join and support.
Absolutely. And just when you were talking then, the video was slowed down a little bit and it felt like a very psychedelic, natural experience watching you talk about food and how important food is, because it absolutely is. You know, it's one of those things that we forget. We forget how important it is just to have food locally. And Jeff Lawton and his crew through the permaculture movement have shown it doesn't matter where you live, in cold climates, hot climates, desert climates, high climates, low climates. You can create your own food no matter where you live. And with that knowledge, with that power, it can show us that we can create local economies through locally created foods and actually connect once again to nature through how we actually eat.
Yeah.
Well, look, Helena, what an amazing conversation. We could probably talk for the next 5 hours. So we'll have to definitely catch up again and continue this conversation one time. It's been amazing, and I really hope our audience has not just enjoyed it, but learned a few things too. So thank you very much.
And thank you for doing this. It's such an important thing to do. I'm really grateful to you for trying to get this out widely and for really putting together a package like this. Sounds like a great idea. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Helena.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, what a great conversation. I'll do a quick wrap up with a few key points we should walk away with. Helena really helped us to understand, for starters, what a gem she is and how we need more people working in her field, sort of helping to mitigate some of the impacts of globalization and corporate tyranny on local communities. Now, it's pretty clear, woven throughout that video, that we are disconnecting from nature through the prisons of consumerism and materialism. It was very clear to Helena through the Ladakh community how those sorts of ideological frameworks impacted them in not just practical ways, but also psychological, emotional and spiritual ones too. We definitely need to look at how we organise our food, how we decide to contribute to our communities. What can we do is, in simple terms, is just support local business, not make sure that we're sourcing our food from a healthy, local or regional and sustainable type providers. There's a whole array of practical things that we can do on the ground level, but also this needs to be looked at pretty seriously in a political sense, as well as an individual community sense as well. So if you want any further information, please check out her sites and read her books. And there's plenty of YouTube videos and the documentary, The Economics of Happiness. They're all definitely very worthy sources of information to really educate ourselves on these sorts of issues. So thanks for joining us, and until next time, I'm Philip J. Watt. Cheers.